Okay, welcome back to the next video in this AI learning series. As you can see on my screen, we're looking at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's local climate action grants. This is what has been selected. If you're a part of the VIP Access Member Pass, thanks for joining in that group. You have a little bit more information about how I got to the point of selecting this particular grant and how I keep things organized on the back end so that I have people sending me grant opportunities and I'm keeping some of that information organized within my inbox. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has about $2.3 million in funding for this project, and that's for fiscal year 2024. The idea is that they want to be using this for local climate action planning and implementation projects, and there's the potential that they will have additional funding for this. So when you scroll down and you look at this, we've got, all right, maximum grant award for this request for proposals, that's what RFP stands for, is $50,000. There is no minimum. If you want to apply for this, you're going to go ahead and click on this link that will take you to the portal. This is through the state agency, and you'll go ahead and click on opportunities. Pro tip on this, Command F or Control F depending on if you're using PC or Mac, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put in MPCA. Then I'm gonna scroll down and see what it brings me. It looks like my video is hovering over a little bit, so I have to control this. But then you'll see, okay, local climate action grants is right here. It ends in 7 days. We are down to the wire, friends. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on that. And just to let you know, this isn't the first time I'm looking at this. I'm a little bit ahead of the game. I'm just behind in recording. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this view bid package right here. And then this is going to open up a series of documents that are typically included as part of a grant, depending on where it's coming from. At the state and federal level, they'll usually have this many documents. From foundations or maybe local regional grants, they will typically have a little bit less documentation. So RFP, that stands for Request for Proposals. That's going to be an overall outline of what the grant proposal is, eligibility criteria, maybe when the funding is available. They'll talk about match requirements, that kind of a thing. This is the actual application. A work plan, this is likely a sample of what we will be filling in. The budget, then they'll have the sample agreement. They've got some questions and answers that they posted, and that's after having a public comment period. They also have a recording of a webinar where they provided a little bit more information about the grant, and then it looks like they've got a PDF as well with event details. I'm honestly not sure what that means. But basically, I took the most important documents from this section and I've uploaded it to our folder here under bid package documents. So I have these accessible to me. I would highly recommend doing that, because think of what you would have to do every time that you want to look at those documents. If you're having to go to the MPCA's webpage, then you're having to download this stuff and then look at it. It's just a mess. So save yourself the headache, put all the information in one spot, and then we'll take a look at the actual application and some of the progress that I have made so far. And I'm also going to show you basically how I have used ChatGPT up to this point to be able to help me in the application. I'll have a separate video that goes over creating an application with the account, creating an account with ChatGPT, just so that you have a better sense of getting into that platform altogether. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can all see this, and I think this should be pretty good. So Partnership for Health is likely to be the lead organization on that, and this is just based on conversations that we've had within our planning team. I'm going to leave most of that stuff blank just because it probably isn't information that you need to know at this point. But conversations that we had as a planning team resulted in us selecting these two options. We're not developing plans at this point. We already have the plans in place. And if you've looked at some of the earlier videos, we invested a lot of time in creating a regional food systems plan. Now, the other resource that I would like to point you to is the climate action plan, and this is where this particular funding source was decided upon. That we had a lot of community investment from different individuals and stakeholders across the region that ended up publishing this 150-page climate action plan. Now, what's cool about this is that when you go into the content, you can look at and see that there is a particular section called local food and agriculture. This shows in Region 4. I think that this number is vastly underrepresented. 3 community gardens, absolutely not. We have more than that. Whoever did the research on that is clearly not plugged into the food system space. We won't focus our time on talking about that. What's interesting here is that if we go to the next couple of pages, this is where we can start making the connection between the local action plan that was created, the regional food systems plan that was created, and this particular application. So what we have identified as a team is that there are 2 items in particular that are most relevant to what our subcommittees are working on. This includes Strategy 1 and Strategy 2. The first one is to reduce food waste and hunger, achieve a 50% reduction in food insecurity region-wide by 2030, and then the second one is increase production of and access to local food, particularly serving food insecure and low-income individuals. Now, if you go to this section here, there's actually all kinds of supporting actions that have been identified. If you recall, in our regional food systems plan, we also have a set of different strategies and action steps based on feedback from people that we talk to in the region. This is the same, right? This is all feedback from people within the region about things that they said, let's do this in order to address this issue. So we have lots of good ideas. The question now is, how do we marry what's happening here, what's happening in the regional food systems plan, and this grant application? What you'll find is that this is looking at actions intended to reduce local contributions of causes to climate change. And up to this point, I'll be honest, that hasn't been a huge focus within our Food Council. That's not to say that the connection isn't there. So what we're looking at is, because of our funding limitations, we don't have $25,000 in cash to be able to put towards this effort. We have pretty much nothing, no cash in hand, because up to this point, most of the efforts that have been led around the Food Council have been grant funded to date, and that's just paid for staff time. So there hasn't necessarily been any mechanism that was built into that process that would create revenue generation. This is something I'm particularly interested in thinking about, and I'm not really sure what the answer looks like yet, but it's something I'd like to consider building into our funding proposals so that we don't find ourselves in this constant process of needing to generate income, for example, or needing to rely on grants to fund our staff. So we're going to pursue this one where it's less than 20,000 as a population that we are serving. This requires a 5% match that can be done via in-kind or local funds. So in-kind means that you could use, for example, the contribution of, like if you're building something, construction materials or supplies, or if you are doing something that's more maybe like labor intensive and people's time is what you can contribute. That would be where some of this comes in. Then what you'll have is we're going to have a total project cost, and that will be the grant requested plus the local match. In the next one, it's asking if the applicant is a sole source of matching funds, and I selected no on that because I do believe that from our partners, we're going to have in-kind time that serves as the match. And then yes, they're in compliance with Minnesota's tax and environmental regulatory requirements. So this next section I wrote based on my intimate knowledge of this Food Council and what we have been doing up to now. I did not use ChatGPT at all to write this section. This is just based on what I know. So we propose to use funds, and granted, this is just draft content now. I'm still going to meet with our project team in a couple of days, get some feedback, so it's very possible that this will change and shift a little bit, especially as some of the parts of the application become clear. So we propose to use funds from the MPCA to support the implementation of West Central Minnesota's Climate Action Plan through the region's Food Council. And then it provides some context on the planning process, which I described in a previous video. We summarize the results into 8 priorities, and at the same time, this climate action planning process was taking place. Funds from this project will be used to fuel community-based food projects led by members of our regional Food Council, addressing several local food and agriculture strategies outlined in the action plan. Now, I think it's important that when you are writing a grant application, you should almost always write the summary last. The reason I took a stab at this is because I'm also in the process of reviewing other grant applications for a different process, and it's giving me a lot of ideas about the framing. Numbers are important, and this is something that I even commented. Make sure to include a single sentence that summarizes how many people we anticipate reaching with this work, because oftentimes that's a question in terms of impact. The other thing that I want to point you to is that I created a document myself, which is just a project summary designed to share with our planning team members that gives them a sense of what are we trying to fund with this in the first place, just in very plain terms, so that we can go into writing this grant process with a pretty clear vision, and we'll have opportunities to maybe massage some stuff here and there so that it fits better with what this application is looking for. The first thing on the list is to host another regional food tour. This was a wild success when we did this during the planning process for this regional food systems plan. We heard such good feedback from all the participants, from like Minnesota Department of Agriculture staff that were involved, and they said, like, thank you so much. This is the reason why I do what I do, and this is what motivated me to get into this kind of work in the first place. That feedback was tremendous, and the connections that we facilitated between people as a result of it was just bar none in line with everything that this Food Council stands for and what we are trying to address, especially as it relates to fostering connections between food systems actors and making sure that people are doing the best in terms of using their energy the most efficiently and their resources as well. So this is very much in line with what we're trying to accomplish, and we'll figure out how to also communicate that it's in line with some of the conservation and kind of like greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. Another one is to provide funds for our Food Council members to implement their projects. So this is one area where a lot of times planning just kind of gets stuck, is you come up with a plan, you maybe have some volunteers who are engaged, but then they're the ones that are responsible for finding funds to be able to implement specific projects. And I feel like a lot of times that's where stuff gets stuck and the potential just kind of becomes stagnant. So my goal is to really give people something to work with, and know that, trust that they understand their community best, that they're going to be very thoughtful about how they use those dollars and invest them into the community. The next one, and this came about as I was working on writing yesterday, was thinking about what is the role of climate data within this entire process. One of the things that I helped kind of inform the design of was a data party that was facilitated by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and a bunch of other partners, where they were doing this project to look at numbers that they had gathered focused specifically on smaller scale agricultural projects and businesses, organizations, because a lot of times we don't have the data around that stuff. And it was really revealing some of the information about, like, wow, a lot of people fall within the small scale ag space aren't filling out the census. And that's where so many people are getting their data to make decisions. So I was thinking, why not take the data that we have from this climate action plan, for example, and also the data that we've pulled in from our regional food systems plan, and play with it, right? So we could host that both for the public and Food Council members to both highlight and educate folks on the direct connection between our food choices, agricultural production techniques, and conservation initiatives, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And participants from the public would have the opportunity to work with our council members to outline what are the ways that we can more deeply integrate some of these carbon reduction goals into our work. And also, I think it would be really interesting to dig into this question of what are the metrics that motivate you the most? Like, what's the most compelling? Because it's one thing to talk about the numbers and to be overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, the food system is really messed up. What are we going to do? Where do we start? How do we prioritize action? Versus, wow, did you know that just purchasing one item per week from a local farmer can bring this many more dollars to your community? Whatever that looks like, I would be really interested in seeing what people have to say. And part of that comes from one of the survey elements from this climate action plan, where people were looking at, and I think it'll be somewhere, in terms of when people said, oh, they have like what would you say, that we need to be reducing this. Like this stat is particularly interesting. Community input. 88% of respondents have noticed signs of climate change, while 75% reported being personally impacted by the effects of climate change. Then, get this. The question was, how much do you agree with the following statement? It is important for our county/region to take action to prepare for the projected impacts of climate change, like more heat waves, heavier rain events, and more days of poor air quality. And only 53% said that they completely agree. So to me, there's a really big disconnect between what's happening with our community and our sense of responsibility towards taking action. And I'm particularly interested in understanding, when it comes to local food and agriculture, where do people feel most inspired to make changes? What's the easiest? What's like the lowest hanging fruit? And what is our food council's role in supporting that change? Because imagine if we had 10, 20 people in every single maybe zip code region or small city within our 4-county region decide, I am going to spend 5% more of my annual budget on the local foods. Imagine the demand that would create among our local producers. And then there might be this question of, how do we supply that, right? There's all kinds of questions that will come into play. But I just wanted to provide some additional context on how I want to bring these things together. The last thing on this list is to provide support for Food Council administration/facilitation, including an intern to support the project. Okay, the last item is to provide support for Food Council administration and facilitation, since that's a very real cost of this work, including an intern that can support this over the project time period. And that's something that's sort of near and dear to my heart, is just providing professional development opportunities for young people and giving them exposure to this kind of work at an early stage in their career. So let's get back into this application draft. We have basically, this last part was copy paste from the action plan. I didn't change any content from that. This is where things start to get interesting and where I'm excited to share with you what was coming to mind. So what they have is they want you to describe the expected outcomes and benefits with quantitative metrics if possible. And this is good because I didn't even pay attention to that the first time. So with quantitative metrics is something I'm going to highlight, and I'm also going to make a note of integrating that. Integrate metrics, and I think I need to make this slightly smaller so that I can see that. Okay, so I'm going to pull up ChatGPT. If you've gotten to this point, hopefully you've already seen the video that is about creating an account. So I'm just going to go to this particular thread, which is where I started. Ojo, right? Key here. This is something we say in Spanish, like ojo, like pay attention. The first thing that I always do is think about, who am I? I'm inventing a persona for the person that is going to respond to this question. So the first sentence that I put in here is, you are a grant writer with 15 years experience and have been tasked with helping the Regional Food Council of West Central Minnesota apply for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Local Climate Action Grant. And then I copied content from the MPCA's website, and we'll come back to it. I literally took, content from, I think, this section right here, and we'll see that. MPCA seeks proposals for projects that develop or implement plans of action. So this content right here is not mine. Let's look at where I found that. Eligibility, how to apply, more information. Yeah, actually it is. So I copied this content and then I put it in here to give this person more context on what is the opportunity and the priority. Then I said, based on the following project summary, please identify at least 3 potential outcomes that can be described in the grant. And then I copied my own content that I had written earlier in the application, where I'm describing the summary, and I used that to prompt it to write potential outcomes for me. And yes, and then I end it with a quote. So that part is closed. And get this is what it spit out. And I was blown away, right? Like, I never know what to expect with this, but I was really impressed. First one, increase community resilience. It gives me both outcome and impact. By implementing community-based food projects, the region will enhance its resilience to the impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events and shifts in growing conditions. Absolutely. Impact. These projects will promote local food production, distribution, and consumption, reducing reliance on distant food sources vulnerable to disruptions caused by climate-related challenges. Absolutely. Second one, enhanced food security and access. Outcome. Through the implementation of initiatives outlined in the Climate Action Plan, the community will experience improved food security and access to fresh, nutritious food. Yes, this is exactly what we're about. Impact. By supporting local food production and distribution systems, the region will mitigate the effects of climate change on food availability and affordability, particularly for vulnerable populations. Yes. And then, get this, they start to talk about reduced carbon footprint, which is another priority that was described up top. Outcome. The projects funded by the grant will contribute to reducing the region's carbon footprint by promoting sustainable agriculture practices and reducing food miles. And the impact of that is by prioritizing local food production and distribution, the region will decrease greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation and storage, aligning with the goals of the Climate Action Plan to mitigate climate change. So one of the things that I wanted to pull up was, this is a copy of the webinar that MPCA put out with a little bit more of a description of what they're trying to go for. And this particular piece was what spoke to me, the equitable piece in terms of evaluating the outcomes that chat spit out. Because to me, that's missing. And this is where, again, like, the critical thinking really has to come in. This is a tool, but you have to be willing to ask yourself, in the broader context of what you're doing, does this make sense? So with that, I decided to give it some more feedback. This is what I wrote. So you'll see, right, I can toggle between the first one and the second response that it spit out. So the second one, I've added this sentence at the end, let's go back to 2, where it says, please ensure that one of these outcomes is related to creating a more equitable food system. And I really like, you'll see the format of this is completely different than the first one. And so sometimes that happens, right? Like, it'll spit out something that's very different than what you had originally asked for. So this one I really appreciated, the promotion of food equity and social justice, that it's very much in line with the priorities and the goals of our food systems plan. And now we know it's also in line with what the climate vision is for the state of Minnesota. So what I ended up doing was going through and adding some things. I copied, I think, this first line, but then I added, okay, how many people do we plan on engaging through these different projects? And how is that connected to the food systems plan? It's connected to better communication between food systems actors. We're hoping that at least 200 people are engaged through both the regional food tour and other community-based projects that our food council members would implement and oversee. The second one, I kind of merged the responses from both the first and the second prompt. And I also kind of blended the titles so that it made sense. Enhanced food equity through security and access. And so we just have, through the implementation of initiatives outlined in the Climate Action Plan and the Regional Food Systems Plan, the community will experience improved food security and access to fresh, nutritious food by engaging diverse stakeholders and addressing the needs of underserved populations, such as low-income communities and communities of color. The project will work towards eliminating food deserts, increasing access to fresh and nutritious food, and supporting local food entrepreneurship opportunities. One key example of that is launching of a new farmers market within Parker's Prairie, and that's within our region. So we can probably integrate some numbers into this. How many people do we anticipate reaching within that particular initiative, for example? Education, whatever that looks like. How many farmers are going to be engaged in terms of maybe selling their product? And then the last one, I didn't end up adding as much content to, because this is where I'm still struggling to try to figure out what's going to work best. Outcome number 3, reduce carbon footprint. The projects funded by the grant will contribute to reducing the region's carbon footprint by promoting sustainable ag practices and reducing food miles, which is true. but we're gonna have to be a little bit more concrete about what that looks like. There's a section where it's implementation projects only. That's what we're doing. Discuss whether the proposed actions to be implemented is included in existing plan, and if so, describe the process used and participants included in developing that plan. And then it gives you a max of 400 words. Describe the process used and participants included in developing that plan. That's actually everything that I included in the first part of this, like the summary. And so I was like, all right, let's just copy paste that. It's not a big deal. And then basically what I took actually was within the climate action plan on the very beginning when they talk about, I think, the planning process page. Let's go back to that one. And the thing that I wanted to skip to was the planning process and just show you how I can do this. So there was a 400 word max for that particular section, and I knew that, like, for example, if I just go here and I try to figure out how many words, review, word count, that's 165. So I could, in fact, leave that entire section, but in comparison to the amount of information that I described for the Food Council, I was like, this is too much. So I could say, please summarize the following content and reduce it by half. And then I always put it in quotes just so that it's clear where the start and ending points. I honestly don't know if that's a requirement, but this is spitting out in a matter of seconds a summary that's including this information. It still gets the point across. And I didn't have to think at all about doing that. I didn't have to take the time to do that. So within this section, we have a summary. And then we went on to the next section, looking at the use of climate change data. Planning projects, we're not doing that one, which is really funny because I just realized I answered this and I probably didn't need to, because we're actually an implementation project. But this is okay. I took this information, again, directly from the Climate Action Plan. It is not original content. I did not need to write that. Data sources is one of the things that it asks for in here. List specific data sources that will be used. I'm still not 100% sure if we're going to need to include this section based on the fact that we're doing an implementation project, but I think it's still important to have a data-driven process. So what I found were this idea that came to mind of, okay, we should probably also be doing an annual assessment as it relates to our food systems work, so we can look at food systems connectivity and communication, since that was one of our highest priorities. We can and use the results-based assessment framework. That's something that I'm trained in. My entire team with creating community consulting is trained in. And then we're looking at outcome 2. Again, this is related to the top of the application where it was outlining those 3 outcomes, using the food security dashboard from the Healthy Foods, Healthy Lives Institute from the University of Minnesota. And then for outcome 3, looking at Minnesota Region 4's greenhouse gas inventory. This was a recommendation from MPCA in that PowerPoint application. So that's where I got that information from. And then I included an example of where original data could come from. So for example, the Parker's Prairie Farmers Market being launched through the Regional Food Council may ask market attendees if shopping in the market has helped them reduce their transportation costs associated with grocery shopping, or if they're aware of how many miles are currently associated with their non-farmers market food purchases. We hope to raise awareness about the connections between food system and transportation costs / greenhouse gas emissions through these initiatives. Then it says planning projects that address local contributions to climate change. I didn't answer that because I wasn't working on it. Then it asks community-based organization and educational institution projects, and it's asking discuss how data about greenhouse gas emissions from specific community facilities and or community member activities will be used to inform the project. List specific data sources and or calculations that will be used. This is where the data part came up. And then we get into implementation projects, which is where I think I actually should have been working on. And again, right, like this is part of the process. Is probably a best practice that I should have mentioned is like read through the entire application first. That was what you're supposed to be responding to. I also recommend, if you have the ability to, try to print this off and highlight things that are important and matter, because you will miss some of the finer details if you don't. This next section will talk about areas of concern for environmental justice. And so it's going to be asking me about using the MPCA's criteria and interactive mapping tool. And I'm going to be looking at, is this geographic area specifically addressed by the proposed project include one or more MPCA identified areas of concern for environmental justice? And then I have to explain that. If yes, will the planning and or action be undertaken encompass and scope be located in and or yield benefits for the underserved communities within environmental justice areas of concern? Yes or no? If yes, what are those? And then I have to describe those communities, how they will benefit from the project, and or discuss whether there's a potential for harm to these communities from the project. I think these questions are brilliant. So then the next one is looking at engagement and involvement. We're going to be describing what groups will be engaged through this project to address climate change and how they will be involved. I think this is going to be a really cool one for us to be able to respond to because of the nature of food systems work and food council work. It's very grassroots, community oriented and driven. Next, we're going to talk about the co-benefits from project completion to ensure a lasting impact. And I will be focusing on this one, implementation projects. Describe what, if any, co-benefits the deliverables will provide for the community to help ensure a lasting impact. And this, again, is also something that I'm thinking about in terms of the timeline for this, because that's a really big challenge in terms of what data are you going to use to evaluate the success of your program and that kind of thing, and like how are you going to measure impact to greenhouse gas emissions? Well, okay, let's be real here. The funding applications close on the 24th. Let's look at this. The project has to be completed by June of 2025, and it doesn't even say how quickly the turnaround is going to be. So say, for example, applications close in April. Maybe they start reviewing the applications in May. They notify people in June, and maybe it takes another month or two. So let's say July, August, before funds are available. If that is true, that provides basically less than 12 months for any of these projects to be implemented. And I think that when we look at impact, it's really important to consider that. These are short-term projects. And if we don't know that additional funding is it says the potential for additional funding, it's really hard to bank on anything in particular. It's like, okay, what's a one-time investment that could continue to reap dividends or rewards for the community? This is not a multi-year grant application, and the amount is also fairly small, right? $50,000 is not that much. So, coming back to these questions, we're looking at implementation projects. Describe what specific annual reductions of greenhouse gas emissions are anticipated to result from the project and how these reductions were calculated. I'm really struggling with that one. So I'm going to be asking my project team about that in a couple of days to really think about, okay, where are we going with that? You'll see I started to answer some of these questions as well. Discuss how the project will be resilient to climate change and or support community resiliency based on current Minnesota climate trends and projections of future conditions. And it's asking, okay, what are the specific data sources that you've used, and describe calculations to determine resiliency. So we passed that, and then we're looking at co-benefits, barriers and challenges, and then we're going to be looking at metrics to track project success. And then it has a section about describing the experience, qualifications of the people involved. That's going to be pretty easy to write based on previous applications that have already been put in. I know that we've got those kind of bios already created just because the organizations I've been working with they're pretty experienced grant writers as well. If you are struggling to write something like this, I'll show you ways that you can generate some content like that if you don't have something that's already written. So that was a lot of information to take in. Thank you for holding on to the end. In the next video, I'll walk you through in more depth the process of me working through this application and continuing to do the writing and showing you the ways that I'm using the sort of ChatGPT tool to support me in this work. All right, happy writing, folks.